Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on Impact Assessment for World Heritage, held as part of the ICCROM lecture series. Before we start, let me just go over some housekeeping points for this webinar. You can send your queries and comments via the Q&A icon that you see at the bottom of the Zoom window. Please don't just raise your hands, but actually phrase the questions for us so that we can actually take them on board when we're moderating the Q&A session. We will take up some questions after all the presentations are made. And in case that we are unable to answer all of your questions, keep in mind that this is the first part of a two-part webinar. So we might actually have to answer your questions next week in conjunction with the content that we deliver in the next webinar in 2 weeks' time. But also, we are happy to answer you via email if you have any pending queries left. I would like to welcome everybody to this webinar. My name is Eugene Zhou, and I work as the program manager for the World Heritage Leadership Program here at ICCROM. It's a program that is jointly delivered together with IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, in collaboration with ICOMOS, International Council of Monuments and Sites, and UNESCO World Heritage Centre. And I will be moderating this session of the webinar. ICCROM, the International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, is an intergovernmental organization working to promote the conservation of all forms of cultural heritage in every region of the world. We are one of the 3 advisory bodies to the World Heritage Convention, and today's webinar is organized together with all of our sister advisory bodies, both ICOMOS and IUCN, as we are collaborating together within the framework of the leadership program to move forward on different issues regarding heritage management. The leadership program is a capacity building program that aims to improve the conservation and management practices for culture and nature through the work of the World Heritage Convention. We treat the World Heritage Sites contributing to sustainable development as an integral component of the overall program itself. And we are currently working on integrating the management manuals on nature and culture together. We are also revising the disaster risk management manual and updating the upcoming impact assessment guidance document, which is our key theme for today's webinar. But we're also adapting the management effectiveness assessment toolkit for World Heritage Sites. Along with all of our efforts to generate more easily accessible and applicable knowledge resources, we deliver capacity building activities through the format of courses, workshops, fora, to reach a wider audience. For more information on the program itself of World Heritage Leadership, I would ask interested listeners to access one of our previous webinars that was provided on June 11. It's also uploaded on the ICCROM website and also the YouTube channel. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's speakers. And I would actually ask all of our speakers, our 3 panelists, to turn their videos on and wave as I introduce them. Please, thank you. Okay, we will be joined by Ms. Sarah Court, who currently works with ICCROM as the focal point for the impact assessment work here. Ms. Mizuki Murai, World Heritage Conservation Officer in the World Heritage Program Unit of IUCN. And Mr. Richard Makai, ICOMOS focal point for the work on World Heritage Impact Assessment. All of us were working very closely together to produce a consolidated guidance for conducting impact assessment on both natural and cultural World Heritage properties, as well as collaborating on delivering various different courses and workshops. So thank you for that. You can now turn your videos off and I will introduce one by one the presentations. Today we will cover the basic aspects of what constitutes an impact assessment and how it relates to the conservation and protection of World Heritage Sites. This is the first part of a 2-part webinar where during the next session, we will go into more details about the steps and processes of conducting an impact assessment. So if you have any questions regarding those details of steps and processes, we'll take that into consideration and try to answer your questions through the next session. And again, I remind all our viewers and listeners to use the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar. The impact assessment is basically an approach and methodology that can promote better evidence-based decision-making in advance of planning for change at or near World Heritage properties. It can be a very useful tool to make sound decisions concerning regarding heritage conservation and protection in general, but it also gives us a chance to harness sustainable development agenda and opportunities if we use it properly. The process that we present here for World Heritage, the principles can actually be applied to the wider heritage in general, wider heritage sites in general. And it can be used in various different circumstances of either as a standalone process or sitting within a broader assessment process involving environmental impact assessments or strategic environmental assessments. Now, those are a lot of different categories of impact assessments that I just talked about, and you may ask what they are. So without further ado, I would now like to turn over the floor to Sarah Court, who will introduce to us the subject of IA, impact assessments, what it is and why we need to be using it. Sarah is a long-standing collaborator with ICCROM, working on issues of people-centered approaches, sustainable development, and World Heritage management. So I give the floor over to Sarah.
Yes. Let me just start sharing my presentation. Okay, well, good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're listening to us today. Now, hopefully some of you are listening because you're already interested in impact assessment, but there might be others of you wondering why we're dedicating 2 webinars to this subject. So today we're hoping to convince you that this is one of the most useful tools you can use when you're considering a proposal that might affect your World Heritage property. So I want to start by just taking a quick look at the state of play of World Heritage today, because not only are there many more properties than were ever foreseen when the concept of World Heritage was launched, but they seem to be just facing increasing threats. Now, analysis right around the world shows that heritage places are facing problems linked to development projects, including new buildings, infrastructure, tourism projects, and other things. And World Heritage is not exempt from this. As you can see from this, this chart here, the sheer number of properties who are reporting these problems and the increasing number of impact assessments that the World Heritage Committee is requesting each year to evaluate them. So we have a situation where states parties have an obligation to protect and conserve World Heritage from such threats, but at the same time, there are also increasing expectations that heritage should be contributing to contemporary society. Now, these include many positive opportunities for heritage to contribute to big issues such as well-being, social inclusion, peace and security, poverty alleviation, and many other areas. And in particular, there are now new obligations for World Heritage properties to contribute to sustainable development. And there was the adoption of a specific policy on this theme. So how does that link to impact assessment? Well, we believe that it's one of the tools that can help you look at both these future threats and potential opportunities. And at the core is a basic but really vital concept that we need to think before we act. In our case, impact assessment is a way of approaching a proposed action, and it can be large or small, and ensure that the consequences on outstanding universal value and other values of a World Heritage property are really thought through in a participatory way and in advance. Now, Richard and Mizuki today are going to be providing some case study examples, And we'll be looking, as Eugene mentioned, at the actual process, the steps of how to carry out an assessment in 2 weeks' time. But in this introduction, let me just offer you a few general points. So this is a really useful definition by the International Association for Impact Assessment, and they've been providing support to improve our current work in this area. Now you'll see that their definition highlights exactly how impact assessment is rooted in sustainable development thinking. And this explains why it's such a key tool for integrating a sustainable development perspective into World Heritage processes. Now, there are 2 ways in which impact assessment can work in this direction, both as a tool that can help the planning process itself and as a tool to help support better decision making. Now, it's useful to note, as Eugene already referred to, that impact assessment comes in many shapes and sizes, and you'll meet a lot of language, different terms as you enter into this world. But it's useful to note that all types of impact assessment share a common approach, a way of thinking. Now, some of you might be familiar with working with strategic environmental assessments or environmental impact assessments as part of your own national frameworks. Now, you'll see in this diagram very quickly that the main difference is that strategic assessments usually help to shape policies, plans and programmes, whereas an environmental impact assessment will be looking at the consequences of a specific proposed project. There'll be others of you who are more familiar with a heritage impact assessment, as the World Heritage Committee are often requesting these for cultural heritage properties these days. But there are many other variants, and you'll see just a couple of extra examples here, and the particular name is showing the main focus of that type of assessment. Now, while there can be advantages to assessments that take a specific focus, our work is aiming to make greater connections between assessments and, wherever possible, ensure that World Heritage is better integrated into all these different types of assessment when they take place. This is because experience is showing that to work in silos can have really negative results. World Heritage can be left in isolation and becomes much more vulnerable, while other heritage places can be given less protection and ignored to a greater extent. Instead, we found that in any case, World Heritage never truly exists in isolation, and there are clear advantages to considering it within its wider context. Another problem is that it's difficult to take decisions with a sustainable development perspective because all too often there's a mistaken attempt to balance the positive and the negative. There are attempts to prove that benefits from a project could outweigh any damage caused to people or places. Instead, we'd like to argue that we need to get better at using impact assessment well and taking advantage of it as a tool for improved planning so that we get better at finding those creative solutions that lie at that magic area in the centre here. And it's where all areas of our world will therefore benefit. And I think this is a really useful illustration that helps to underline this point. We need to remember that benefits for economic and societal goals can never be truly gained when they're considered alone. They need to be seen as embedded within their wider environmental context. And this great redesign of the Sustainable Development Goals really illustrates that success is dependent on progress in all spheres. We can't achieve individual goals without consideration of their interdependencies with those other targets. And it's this sort of thinking that lies behind our recent efforts to revise the guidance document for impact assessments in the World Heritage context. And this is a revised document that's been through an extensive review process at this point among both practitioners and advisory bodies, and it's going to be ready for publication in the near future. But while we're waiting that short time, I just thought it was useful to conclude with some of the key points that are coming out of that work. It's really useful to note that impact assessment is a flexible approach that's suitable for considering policies and projects of all sizes and types. This means that it's not just to be used when you're required to do so under your national legislation, or if the World Heritage Committee asks it in a decision, it's potentially a tool, a way of thinking that you can even use voluntarily at the place that you're working. It doesn't matter which type of impact assessment is being carried out. It doesn't matter what the name of it is. If it is looking at World Heritage, then there needs to be a focus on outstanding universal value. However, having said that, we cannot just look at outstanding universal value in isolation. Now, that's in terms of both looking at it not only within the boundaries of a property, but also making sure that we're looking at outstanding universal value together with other heritage values. And a holistic approach is always going to lead to better analysis and therefore to better outcomes. Another key to success is greater participation. A single specialist should not be carrying out an impact assessment by themselves. An intersectoral team is needed with a range of inputs from different disciplines according to the particular situation. And of course, rights holders, now those people who have legal or customary rights with respect to a World Heritage property, they must be involved throughout the process. And there will be other affected and interested parties with a stake in the outcome of the impact assessment, including the local community, and they will need to be engaged in different ways too. Finally, it is absolutely vital that we get the timing right on these assessments. It's useless to carry out an impact assessment after the decisions have been made and after commitments have been taken. An impact assessment needs to be part of and needs to inform the planning process. And heritage needs to be a key element taken into consideration from the early stages. So if we, as heritage practitioners, are not already part of those dialogues around our World Heritage properties, then we really need to go out and begin to make contact with the appropriate people in relevant ministries and departments so that we can ensure that World Heritage is both better protected and plays a greater role in our society today. So thank you all for listening, and let me now hand back to Eugene.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As you can see, adopting impact assessment procedures is a very tangible way of arriving at and actually doing sound and good management decision-making processes for World Heritage sites, that we can concentrate on the conservation and protection of OUV, but also harness sustainable development goals as well. And thank you, Sarah, for the last slide on highlighting the different points to keep in mind. I would now like to give the floor to Mizuki Murai, who will talk about IUCN's work on nature conservation and how the impact assessment process figures in the overall management of natural World Heritage sites. Mizuki's role in IUCN involves carrying out ongoing research and monitoring on the state of conservation of natural and mixed World Heritage sites, with particular focus on East and Southern Africa, North America, and Asia. So without further ado, I will hand over the floor to Mizuki.
Thank you, Eugene, for the introduction, and hello to everyone who has joined us online today. In my presentation, I'd like to present from the IUCN perspective on how impact assessments are used in the protection of natural World Heritage and the importance of undertaking timely impact assessments, the detail and depth of which is proportionate to the scale and complexity of the project or programme. Firstly, who is IUCN? The International Union for Conservation of Nature was created in 1948 and is the world's largest environmental network, comprising over 1,400 members from across the world. It has a secretariat and 6 expert commissions made up of more than 15,000 individual experts. IUCN works across a wide range of themes related to environmental and ecological issues. One of its unique roles is to serve as an official advisory body on nature under the World Heritage Convention. This role includes monitoring the state of conservation of natural World Heritage sites and assess the potential impacts of new developments on the values for which a site was inscribed on the World Heritage List. A site can be given World Heritage status for a very wide range of reasons, but they must fit at least one of 10 criteria. Criteria 1 to 6 are focused on cultural values and 7 to 10 on natural values. Criterion 7 represents sites that contain superlative natural phenomena or aesthetic importance, 8 for sites demonstrating outstanding geological features, 9 for outstanding demonstration of ecological and biological processes, and 10 for sites containing important species in its natural habitat. Whichever criterion or multiple criteria a site may be inscribed under, being given the World Heritage status means that they have successfully demonstrated unique and exceptional values called the Outstanding Universal Value, or OUV. OUV is considered to be so important to humanity globally that the site requires recognition and protection. As such, the OUV of a World Heritage Site is irreplaceable and cannot be offset. It is for this reason that the topic of impact assessments are so critical in the context of World Heritage to avoid irreversible damage. The World Heritage Committee has adopted numerous decisions targeted at specific World Heritage sites, but has also taken high-level positions on certain development activities. For example, the committee has stated that mineral, oil and gas exploration and exploitation is incompatible with the World Heritage status, and that such activities should not be undertaken within World Heritage sites. In 2016, the committee also adopted a position that dams with large reservoirs within the boundaries of World Heritage sites is incompatible with their World Heritage status. The committee urged states parties to ensure that the impacts from dams that could affect sites located upstream or downstream within the same river basin are rigorously addressed in order to avoid impacts on the OUV. Of course, it goes beyond dams though, as the World Heritage Convention requires that an impact assessment is undertaken for any intervention that might affect a World Heritage Site. This even extends beyond one country or territory. It's worth noting here that well-defined and well-managed buffer zones surrounding World Heritage Sites add an extra layer of protection from external pressures. So it's important that World Heritage Sites have good buffer zones with effective protection and management regimes. In recent times, pressure for development has led to increased requests by the committee to the states parties to undertake impact assessments. The purpose for the impact assessments is so that the committee, through the advisory body's advice, can support the state party in avoiding negative impacts and help protect the World Heritage Site for future generations. One example of how the World Heritage Committee has influenced decision-making is the East-West Electric Railway project proposal in Nepal. The original project plan proposed a railway alignment that would have cut across Chitwan National Park. In this map, Chitwan National Park is represented in yellow, in the original railway alignment in orange. The World Heritage Committee expressed significant concerns that if constructed, its location would fragment the World Heritage Site, thereby damaging the habitat of important wildlife species such as rhino, tiger and elephant for which this site was inscribed. And the fragmentation may lead to an increase in poaching. Following the World Heritage Committee's concerns, the State Party of Nepal decided to adjust the alignment to avoid crossing the World Heritage Site. This newly proposed alignment is shown here in blue. In the feasibility study for this new alignment, the State Party found that by making the route longer to avoid the World Heritage Site, it serves more significant economic centres, so may in fact be environmentally and economically more sustainable than the original alignment through the World Heritage Site. The committee has requested for a new environmental impact assessment for this revised alignment, and we are yet to see what that looks like and whether this project can go ahead. But this particular case study demonstrates how the World Heritage process altered the course of a transport development. This next example is an unfortunate case of where a state party ignored the committee's decisions, and consequently a development project has led to negative impacts on a World Heritage Site which could have been avoided. IUCN and the World Heritage Committee identified very early on that the retained water of the proposed Mekin hydroelectric dam would flood parts of a World Heritage Site in Cameroon called the WHIA Faunal Reserve World Heritage Site. Back in 2012, the committee requested that the project be suspended until appropriate measures to mitigate the direct and indirect impacts on the OUV had been identified. Despite these requests, the construction of the dam continued without any measures to mitigate the negative impacts. An increase in poaching was recorded around this time. By 2017, filling of the dam's reservoir had begun, and the World Heritage Committee expressed its deep concerns that the partial impoundment had led to flooding in the local area, which damaged forests inside the World Heritage Site, as well as the fields and plantations of local communities nearby. Since then, the state party has reported of efforts to relocate the local communities who were affected by the flooding. The relocation triggers another set of concerns for IUCN, which tangentially relates to impact assessments. IUCN has a clear position on this important matter, which includes the need for process to be fully voluntary and in line with policies of the Convention and relevant international norms, including principles related to free, prior, and informed consent, effective consultation, fair compensation, access to social benefits and skills training, and the preservation of cultural rights. Coming back to the States Party's efforts to date following the damage, nothing has been reported on the States Party's progress to address the environmental impacts of the dam. More recently, the World Heritage Committee requested the State Party of Cameroon to undertake another EIA to identify how to better mitigate the impacts of the dam on the OUV. This case therefore demonstrates not only how an inadequate impact assessment has affected the World Heritage Site, but it also indicates a potentially more expensive and time-consuming process to rectify the problems caused by the poor impact assessment. These two examples relate to individual projects, but in some cases, there may be multiple threats that may be posing a threat on a World Heritage Site. In such cases, it's necessary to consider the cumulative impacts on an ecosystem. The multiple threats on Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada was brought to our attention by an Indigenous group several years ago. The Peace Athabasca Delta, highlighted here in the map, is widely recognised as the particularly vulnerable and valuable core of this World Heritage Site. As a high-latitude, wetland-dominated landscape, the Delta is vulnerable to large industrial developments and their complex interaction with climate change. Environmental threats include hydroelectric dams, oil sands development, and open pit mining, all located outside the World Heritage Site boundaries. But there are also social concerns, such as issues with meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities in the management of this site. These concerns raised by the World Heritage Committee led to the request for a strategic environmental assessment to consider the cumulative impacts of all developments. Based on the recommendations of the Strategic Environmental Assessment, a detailed action plan was developed by the State Party of Canada, comprising 142 actions that are required to protect the OUV of Wood Buffalo National Park. The implementation of these actions has begun and will take many years to complete. This impact assessment process has been helpful for the State Party from the World Heritage angle, but its benefit extend beyond that in taking a holistic view of the state of conservation and the conservation outlook of this important site. In closing, I want to emphasize again the importance of a well-developed impact assessment to avoid damaging the OUV of a World Heritage Site. Impact assessments are an invaluable tool to aid decision-making for the protection of the OUV of a World Heritage Site, which sits at the core of this convention. Thank you. I will now hand back to Eugene.
Thank you very much, Mizuki, for the presentation, showing us the diverse range of types of impact assessments that have been conducted and how that has influenced different decision-making for natural World Heritage sites. Our next speaker is Richard Makai, who will talk about how ICOMOS works within the World Heritage Convention, and how the process of conducting impact assessments is also very closely related to the protection of cultural heritage sites, with some key examples. Richard is currently the ICOMOS focal point for coordinating ICOMOS's inputs for the updated guidance on World Heritage Impact Assessment, but he also works as the ICOMOS advisor on state of conservation for World Heritage properties. I will now hand over the floor to Richard.
Well, thank you, Eugene, and good evening, good afternoon, colleagues. This presentation is particularly focused on heritage impact assessment for cultural properties and is presented from the perspective of ICOMOS. ICOMOS is the International Council on Monuments and Sites. It is a non-governmental body established in 1966 with its secretariat in Paris, and it is particularly focused on conservation, protection, use and enhancement of cultural heritage. Relevantly, as with IUCN and ICCROM, it is one of the official advisory bodies to the World Heritage Committee on the implementation of the convention. And one of the roles it fulfills, as well as evaluating nominations, is of course advising on the state of conservation of properties inscribed on the World Heritage List, and therefore understanding and advising on the potential impact of proposals for change to World Heritage properties is part of the ICOMOS core business. Now, understanding the potential effect on outstanding universal value is absolutely critical to well-informed decision-making for World Heritage properties. And a really critical consideration is that there must be an understanding of the way in which the attributes of individual properties contribute to their outstanding universal value. As the image that's currently on screen illustrates, sometimes the values can be misunderstood. People often assume that values vest in the fabric and the visual quality of the place itself, and perhaps don't look wider at its setting, as might have occurred in the example that's before you. There are, of course, also important intangible attributes of properties that might relate to their use or their associations or meanings. So impact assessment needs to be a holistic process which is mindful of all of the attributes and all of the contributions to OUV. So impact assessment is therefore a very important tool which assists in good decision making for World Heritage places, and that can be good decision making by the local authorities, by the state party to the World Heritage Convention, and of course to the advisors, and the World Heritage Committee itself. And through an impact assessment process, it's firstly possible to assess how specific attributes might contribute to the OUV of an inscribed property. It's then important to relate the attributes to the impacts and to understand what is the potential change that will occur. This, of course, relies on identification of necessary documentation about the project, documentation about the property, so that there is a proper baseline for assessment. And then the system can help also in unpacking and making very clear the logic of the decision-making process. One error that's often made is to meld together the question of the nature of the impact and the evaluation of the impact. So one of the things that's very important in a heritage impact assessment process for World Heritage is to separate the identification of what the impact itself is from a level of its seriousness. This in turn, of course, can guide decisions, and particularly decisions which are incumbent on the state parties to the World Heritage Convention, preferably to avoid, or where that's not possible, to reduce, compensate, or mitigate adverse impacts on outstanding universal value. The impact assessment process, as Mizuki has indicated, has a core logic. Firstly, there's the identification of the contributing attributes, but also it's important to be clear on the nature and extent of the proposal, including things like implications or downstream impacts. It's then necessary to understand clearly how the proposal will affect the property, noting that impacts can be positive and negative. And then it's important to make a judgment about those impacts, whether they are acceptable, particularly to consider whether there are alternatives which would provide a better outcome and better conserve outstanding universal value. A step that is all too often left out is to pause at this point and for decision makers to make a strong decision about whether, in fact, the project or the proposal should proceed. All too often it is the case that impact assessment is done within the frame of an assumption that the project will proceed and that the impact assessment is therefore a tool to identify mitigative strategies. That is not the case. The impact assessment is a tool which is looking to maximise the retention of outstanding universal value, and therefore one of the important considerations is whether the impact is such that the project should not proceed at all. In the event that the decision is made that the project can and should proceed, then of course the HIA impact assessment also identifies means to avoid, reduce or compensate. As has been indicated in Sarah's presentation, the impact assessment methodology is flexible. It works across multiple jurisdictions in different statutory and non-statutory contexts, but it also works and applies to different places, projects and issues. It's also regularly used for monuments and sites, but it can apply to landscapes, urban centres like the mercantile city of Liverpool, which is shown on screen, to large or small buildings, to conservation programs, enormous landscape scale projects, resource extraction, to tourism, and it can also address both tangible and intangible aspects of the place. The remaining part of this section of the webinar is looking at a short series of case studies that should serve to illustrate different ways in which the heritage impact assessment methodology may be used, particularly to support good decision making. And then in the second session in 2 weeks' time, we will delve into more detail, of course, about the specific steps and processes. So the first case study I wanted to show is the Historic Centre of Vienna in Austria, which is a very well-known medieval Baroque city with an extraordinary ensemble of buildings, a very consistent form and scale, an urban morphology that is very much defined by the surrounding Ringstrasse and a series of open parks in the form of the Glacis, dating from the 19th century, but overall a human scale, which has been managed over recent years by very tight urban planning and height controls. However, in recent years, these height controls were amended. And there was a building, the Heumarket development, proposed for the Historic Centre of Vienna, as illustrated on screen. There was much concern, much debate about this proposal, which was considered by the World Heritage Committee, and the property was placed on the list of World Heritage in Danger. While the trigger was this proposed 75, now 66 proposed metre tall tower, in fact, the major threat to the property was the altered controls, which would allow such a development, and their impact on those attributes of the property being the human scale, the urban morphology, the long and short views, and the general form of the historic city. Now, the subject building was at one stage approved by the City of Vienna, but the Austrian government, as the state party to the World Heritage Committee, has intervened collaboratively with the City of Vienna. A detailed heritage impact assessment has been prepared, And this is a very good example of a powerful impact assessment process which has led to a decision that this project should not proceed in its current form. So there is currently a moratorium, and there is a commitment by the Austrian government and the city of Vienna not only to change the individual project, but also to change and to review and change the set of controls that allowed the proposal to come forward in the first place. So here we have a very good example of the HIA, albeit done rather late in the process, informing a very good and very solid values-based decision. The second example that I'd like to share with you comes from the town of Gaul and its fortifications in Sri Lanka. And this heritage impact assessment, which was done for a project that involved a port or changes to the port of Gaul, was undertaken using the methodology outlined in the ICOMOS guidance for heritage impact assessment for World Heritage properties that was prepared in 2011. And this guidance involves colour coding of the various impacts, and you can see in the chart in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen how there was some very clear relating between the values and the attributes of the values and what contributed to outstanding universal value and what didn't, leading ultimately to a tabulated assessment of the impacts and the nature of those impacts, both positive and negative, on the attributes which were part of the outstanding universal value of the World Heritage property. And the heritage impact assessment ultimately concluded that there would need to be some changes to the project in order to avoid negative impacts and to ensure that positive impacts were actually translated into heritage and community benefits. So this is a very good example of excellent use of the HIA methodology to drill down at the attribute level and to work as a tool which improves the project to provide an appropriate and indeed a much improved heritage outcome. My third example is the Stonehenge, Avebury and associated sites World Heritage property in the United Kingdom. And many of you will be aware that there has over recent years been a proposal to construct a new section of a major road currently running through the site and to bury this road in a tunnel. And there are two lessons or 2 points that I'd like to make in sharing this example with you. The first is that the impact assessment process can be a very useful tool for the conceptualization and consideration of a complicated project. And in this case, there have been multiple phases of heritage impact assessment of different options and alternatives. So different routes, avoiding the site, different lengths of tunnel, different types of construction have all been subject to heritage impact assessment. And this has informed the design development process. There is currently a scheme that is under consideration by the UK government, and it has been subject to a very comprehensive heritage impact assessment. And that heritage impact assessment in turn informed a decision by the World Heritage Committee last year that the project as proposed should not proceed in its current form. The UK government as the state party is yet to make a decision in response to that World Heritage Committee position. But the point here is that by rigorously working through what are the attributes, what is the proposal, what is the impact of that proposal on those attributes, those players to this process, be they the UK authorities and the UK government or the World Heritage Committee, are able to make well-informed and appropriate values-based decisions. And so the impact assessment methodology is extremely value-adding. It doesn't only come into play at the very end of a process when a development is up for consideration. It can in fact be extremely useful in an iterative way on the way through the design, development and consideration process. Now, for cultural properties, as at right now, pending the development of the new guidance, the current best practice approach is provided by the ICOMOS guidance on heritage impact assessments for cultural World Heritage properties, which was developed in 2011. And for IUCN, there is an environmental assessment and World Heritage advice note. Part of the proposal during the current World Heritage Leadership Program is that the content of these documents will be amalgamated, combined, refined and developed, resulting in a cohesive and integrated set of guidance on impact assessment for World Heritage properties, which we have been working on diligently and expect to see later in 2020. So thank you, and I think it's probably time for me to hand back to Eugene.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that presentation. I just wanted to hang on the last slide of Richard that he shared about the upcoming guidance. As he has already explained, it is currently being revised and will be presented at the forthcoming session of the World Heritage Committee. The problem with that is that we actually do not have the concrete dates for when the committee will be held as of yet, but as soon as those dates are fixed, we will be able to present the revised guidance in a much more concrete and tangible format. But we are working very diligently to revise it. Now, as you can see from the previous 3 presentations, you can see the various ways that impact assessment procedures can interact with conservation and protection measures and decision-making and planning in different contexts facing different challenges. But we need to keep in mind the basic principles that were highlighted. They absolutely have to be based on the values, the outstanding universal value of the World Heritage property that is being in question. It needs to be interdisciplinary and it needs to happen earlier on in the process to determine the planning aspects, and it needs to be evidence-based. Now, at this point, we have been collecting some questions and comments from our viewers that I would like to direct to our panelists. So if you could all turn on your videos for the Q&A session, please. Thank you. So I have a few questions, but I will just try to merge some of them and ask one for each panelist, and I'll sort of go in the order that you presented. So the first question I would like to direct to Sarah. So the question reads, conducting an impact assessment for a World Heritage site is not so easy because the site is connected with so many different agencies, developers, or residents with all the different agenda and motivations. And on top of that, with the current COVID-19 emergency and added economic pressure, this has actually created the situation to be more complex. So how can we make sure that all these diverse motives and agenda are all taken note of when conducting an impact assessment?
Well, we couldn't have had a webinar without a question about COVID at this time. So I think it's probably just worth noting that, the COVID crisis has been used by some public figures to try and undermine environmental protection and impact assessment in particular, which is worrying. But actually, I think there's a much greater awareness amongst the public now of the fact that if we are just pursuing economic goals and societal goals, and we're not looking at the the environmental implications, we have massive problems. So I think it's actually a very interesting time to be thinking about the future of impact assessment. But coming back to the first part of the question, which was about just the huge numbers of agencies and stakeholders that are involved. For impact assessment, I don't think it's as complex as some people might think, because there is such a mature discipline out there. There are a whole group of people who know what they're doing, do it really well, and there's a lot of resources to help you if you are going to do an impact assessment. The participatory part of it there's just really good methods to follow that mean that you bring all those views together. I would suggest that I wouldn't be so concerned about that element of impact assessment. I think perhaps World Heritage management in general, we might need to get better at that. So looking at our day-to-day management and seeing if we're truly connecting to those agencies already, if we're already aware of the stakeholders around the potential development opportunities, and we need on a daily basis to be connecting with those people and starting the dialogue early and not waiting for the impact assessment as a sort of emergency situation. So I think we need to get better in our day-to-day jobs and not wait for the problem to come up.
Completely agree with you on that one. Okay, I would like to now direct the next question to Mizuki. So in Mizuki's presentation, you cited some examples such as the environmental impact assessment that was conducted on the hydroelectric dam in Cameroon. And then the next example was on the Wood Buffalo Park in Canada, but you phrased it as the strategic environmental assessment. What would be the key differences between the EIA and the SEA in this context, and how would we actually use it in a different manner?
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. So I think it's important to firstly highlight that there are shared key principles between EIAs and SEAs, some of which were covered in Sarah's presentation in her last slide. So such as ensuring the correct experts are involved, the relevant stakeholders are consulted, ensuring they're undertaken early on in the decision-making to inform decision-making rather than a retrospective action. But in terms of the differences between EIAs and SEAs, I'll highlight two points. So firstly, that an EIA is applied to specific and relatively short-term projects, and with the emphasis on mitigating environmental and social impacts of a specific project. Whereas for an SEA, a strategic environmental assessment, it's applied to policies, plans and programs with a broad and long-term strategic perspectives. And it's about identifying more macro level development outcomes. The second key difference I'd like to mention is that for an EIA, it's very much project focused, and therefore there's a limited review of cumulative impacts. The cumulative impacts might be limited to phases of a specific project, and it doesn't cover any regional scale developments or multiple projects. Whereas for a strategic environmental assessment, it inherently incorporates the consideration of cumulative impacts going beyond single projects.
Thank you for that clarification. The final question, the last question that I would like to ask is to Richard. Now, there are some cases for World Heritage sites where during the process of implementing change, there were multiple heritage impact assessments have been conducted. And sometimes these different assessments deliver completely different conclusions and recommendations from one another. So what would be the key point to determine which one is more valid in terms of its content?
I think the first thing that's important is to look at the independence of the assessment team. The most rigorous and best quality work is usually done where there is a separation between the development proponent, the consent authority or the government, and those who are responsible for the assessment. Secondly, there is quite often the trap that I mentioned during the presentation, where the project may well be announced by a government or a major corporation, and after the announcement is done, only then does the impact assessment occur, which means that the impact assessment is directed entirely at mitigation without actually addressing the core issue, which is in fact whether or not the project should proceed at all. So one of the key indicators for an inadequate or inappropriate HIA is where it proceeds from a presumption that the project must be taking place. Thirdly, an HIA that seeks somehow to compensate for adverse effects or for loss of outstanding universal value by some positive community, social, economic benefit is also generally one that is flawed and is not a good foundation for decision making. It's not to say that social and economic issues are not relevant to decision making, but what is critical for the valid HIA process is that the impact, the I in HIA, is actually clearly understood.
Thank you. There are actually a lot of questions pouring in through the Q&A window. The essence of some of the questions would actually pertain to the content of the next webinar. So what we'll do is we'll try to look through all the questions that's been provided through the session. And if we can actually answer your questions through the content of the webinar next time round, we'll try to do that. But in the case of examples of different impact assessments on World Heritage properties to be found, this is actually somewhat of a difficult question to give an overarching answer. Some countries opt for providing a complete transparency policy for all HIA reports. Some countries do not. It's also difficult for us to provide a full overarching spectrum of different case studies through these webinars. But I would just like to highlight that in the upcoming revision of the guidance, what we are trying to do is to at least provide some sorts of case studies that would illustrate different steps of undertaking the impact assessment process, so that it would give you a better understanding of how these are applied on the ground at actual sites. So, and I would just like to remind all our viewers that there are continuous updates happening. We are going through an extensive review process, which will be conducted throughout the rest of this year. And there are also lots of different opportunities to participate in our capacity building activities, so that you can actually get an offline and in a face-to-face environment, or through different online opportunities, more in-depth information about impact assessments. So I would ask you to sign up to the ICCROM newsletter on our website, or to the World Heritage Leadership Facebook page, which you can see some coordinates being provided on the screen. This will allow you to be kept up to date with news about the guidance and other future activities coming up. If you also have any queries regarding the program or about the webinar in general, you can use the email address also provided in the slide. And before concluding this session of the webinar, I would like to once again express gratitude to all of our panelists from our partner organizations and for their time and energy to prepare the presentations, but also engage in the different questions and discussions happening here. I would just like to highlight once more that this is not the end. We have another webinar coming up in 2 weeks, and the same people will appear. So if you have any key questions that you would like to direct, please email us. And we also thank all the attendees participating in the webinar for taking the time to be with us, but also raising important questions. The recorded version of this webinar will be made available on the ICCROM website. So please, if you've missed it through live, or if you need some of the slides, you can actually access it through the YouTube page of ICCROM. So either access the ICCROM website lecture series or the ICCROM YouTube channel. And there are other future webinars coming up as well. Our next session to explain more about the steps and processes of impact assessments will take place on 30th of July, 2020, in 2 weeks' time at the same time. So please join us again. And until then, I wish you goodbye. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you. Bye-bye.